Chapter 21 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggart. Chapter 21. The Colonel Goes Out Shooting. The next morning was fine and still, one of those lovely autumn days of which we get 4 or 5 in the course of a season. After breakfast, Harold Quaritch strolled down his garden, stood himself against a gate to the right of Dead Man's Mount, and looked at the scene. All about him, their foliage yellowing to its fall, were the giant oaks, which were the pride of the countryside, and so quiet was the air that not a leaf upon them stirred. The only sounds that reached his ears were the tapping of the nuthatches as they sought their food in the rough crannies of the bark, and the occasional falling of a ripe acorn from its lofty place on to the frosted grass beneath. The sunshine shone bright, but with a chastened heat. The squirrels scrambled up the oaks, and high in the blue air the rooks pursued their path. It was a beautiful morning, for summer is never more sweet than on its deathbed, and yet it filled him with solemn thoughts. How many autumns had those old trees seen, and how many would they still see, long after his eyes had lost their sight? And if they were old, how old was the Dead Man's Mount there to his left? Old indeed, for he had discovered it was mentioned in Doomsday Book by that name. And what was it? A boundary hill, a natural formation, or, as its name implied, a funeral barrow? He had half a mind to dig one day and find out. That is, if he could get anybody to dig for him, for the people about Honham were so firmly convinced that Dead Man's Mount was haunted, a reputation that it had had from time immemorial, that nothing would have persuaded them to touch it. He contemplated the great mound carefully without coming to any conclusion, and then looked at his watch. It was 10:15, time for him to start for the castle for the day's shooting. So he got his guns and cartridges, and in due course arrived at the castle to find George and several myrmidons in the shape of beaters and boys already standing in the yard. "Please, Colonel, the Squire hopes you'll go in and have a glass of something before you start," said George. So accordingly he went, not to have a glass of something, but on the chance of seeing Ida. In the vestibule he found the old gentleman busily engaged in writing an enormous letter. "Hullo, Colonel," he halloaed without getting up. "Glad to see you. Excuse me for a few moments, will you? I want to get this off my mind. Here, Ida, Ida, Ida," he shouted. "Here's Colonel Quaritch." "Good gracious, father," said that young lady, arriving in a hurry, "you are bringing the house down." And then she turned round and greeted Harold. It was the first time that they had met since the eventful evening described a chapter or two back, so the occasion might be considered a little awkward. At any rate, he felt it so. "How do you do, Colonel Quaritch?" she said, quite simply giving him her hand. There was nothing in the words, and yet he felt that he was very welcome. For when a woman really loves, there is about her an atmosphere of softness and tender meaning which cannot be mistaken. Sometimes it is only perceptible to the favoured individual himself, but more generally is to be discerned by any person of ordinary shrewdness. A very short course of observation in general society will convince the reader of the justice of this observation, and when once he gets to know the signs of the weather, he will probably light upon more love affairs than were ever meant for his investigation. This softness or atmospheric influence or subdued glow of affection radiating from a light within was clearly enough visible in Ida that morning, and certainly it made our friend the Colonel unspeakably happy to see it. "Are you fond of shooting?" she asked presently. "Yes, very, and I have been all my life." "Are you a good shot?" she asked again. "I call that a rude question," he answered, smiling. "Yes, it is, but I want to know." "Well," said Harold, "I suppose that I am pretty fair, that is, at rough shooting. I have never had much practice at driven birds and that kind of sport." "I am glad of that." "Why, it does not much matter. One goes out shooting for the sport of the thing." "Yes, I know, but Mr. Edward Cossey," and she shrank visibly as she uttered the name, is coming, and he is a very good shot and very conceited about it. I want you to beat him if you can. Will you try?" "Well," said Harold, "I don't at all like shooting against a man. It is not sportsmanlike, you know, and besides, if Mr. Cossey is a crack shot, I dare say that I shall be nowhere. But I will shoot as well as I can." "Do you know, it is very feminine, but I would give anything to see you beat him," and she nodded and laughed, whereupon Harold Quaritch vowed in his heart that if it lay in him he would not disappoint her. At that moment Edward Cossey's fast-trotting horse drew up at the door with a prodigious crunching of gravel, and Edward himself entered, looking very handsome and rather pale. He was admirably dressed, that is to say, his shooting clothes were beautifully made and very new looking, and so were his boots, and so was his hat, and so were his hammerless guns, of which he brought a pair. There existed a certain class of sportsmen who always appear to have just walked out of a sporting tailor's shop, and to this class Edward Cossey belonged. Everything about him was of the best and newest and most expensive kind possible. Even his guns were just down from Purdy's, and the best that could be had for love or money, having cost exactly 140 guineas for the pair. Indeed, he presented a curious contrast to his rival. The Colonel had certainly nothing new looking about him: an old tweed coat, an old hat with a piece of gut still twined round it, a sadly frayed bag full of brown cartridges, and at last of all, an old gun with all the brown wore off the barrels, originally cost £17 10s. And yet there was no possibility of making any mistake as to which of the two looked more of a gentleman, or indeed more of a sportsman. Edward Cossey shook hands with Ida, but when the Colonel was advancing to give him his hand, he turned and spoke to the Squire, who at length finished his letter, so that no greeting passed between them. At the time Harold did not know if this move was or was not accidental. Presently they started, Edward Cossey attended by his man with the second gun. "Hullo, Cossey," sang out the Squire after him, "it isn't much use bringing two guns for this sort of work. I don't preserve much here, you know, at least not now. You will only get a dozen cock pheasants and a few brace of partridges." "Oh, thank you," he answered. "I always like to have a second gun in case I should want it. It's no trouble, you know." "All right," said the Squire. "Ida and I will come down with the luncheon to the Spinney. Goodbye." After crossing the moat, Edward Cossey walked by himself, followed by his man and a very fine retriever, and the Colonel talked to George, who was informing him that Mr. Cossey was a pretty shot. He was but rather snappy over it, till they came to a field of white turnips. "Now, gentlemen, if you please," said George, "we will walk through these here turnips. I put two coveys of birds in here myself, and it's rare good lay for them, so I think we had better see if they will let us come up to them." Accordingly they started down the field, the Colonel on the right, George in the middle, and Edward Cossey on the left. Before they had gone 10 yards an old Frenchman got up in the front of one of the beaters and wheeled round past Edward, who cut him over in first-rate style. From that one bird the Colonel could see that the man was a quick and clever shot. Presently, however, a leash of English birds rose rather awkwardly at about 40 paces straight in front of Edward Cossey, and Harold noticed that he left them alone, never attempting to fire at them. The fact was that he was one of those shooters who never take a hard shot if they can avoid it, being always in terror lest they should miss it, and so reduce their average. Then George, who was a very fair shot of the poking order, fired both barrels and got a bird, and Edward Cossey got another. It was not till they were getting to the end of the last beat that Harold got a chance of letting off his gun. Suddenly, however, a brace of old birds sprang up out of the turnips in front of him at about 30 yards, as swiftly as though they had been ejected from a mortar, and made off, one to the right and one to the left, both of them rising shots. He got the right-hand bird, and then turning, killed the other also, when it was more than 50 yards away. The Colonel felt satisfied, for the shots were very good. Mr. Cossey opened his eyes and wondered if it was a fluke, and George ejaculated, "Well, that's a master one." After